Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Well, more and more Aussies are waking up to the extent of the political corruption and the globalist agenda being prioritised over the health, well-being, freedom and sovereignty of everyday Aussies. And on August 31st, Australians all across the country are going to unite and come together to push back against this. So something I've been warning about for years, been more than 6 years since I did this documentary about the coming collapse of Australia. So it's amazing to see people finally waking up to all these issues and fighting for our communities, our future, and for Australia. As they say here on the website, endless migration, weak leadership, political cowardice. And I'm going to get into all that juicy stuff and talk about what is really going on and how we push back. So the times and locations can be found on the official website, which I'll link down below. But let's talk about why this has come about. So Aussies are just fed up with the decline in living standards, the worst in the world in terms of the recent drop. At the same time, we've got the highest paid politician in the world. So, it's almost as if the worse job you do, the more you get paid. But they're actually trying to roll out this globalist agenda. All this stuff that you constantly hear about that's presented as this great, wonderful thing, when really it's just taking away all your freedoms and sovereignty and just ruining society. So if you don't know what is really going on, this is a great film, The Agenda, talking about all of this in detail on YouTube. I'll link that down below as well. But Australia's now got 5 of the most unaffordable housing cities in the top 15. People working everyday honest jobs just can't afford anywhere to live or even rent. And at the same time, you've got our banks being the most profitable in the world. So once again, it's just this economy that's dominated by bank and bank lending into property. And there's just no real economy barely left anymore. And as usual, our big banks are all owned by the global big banks, who have all got shares, owned by BlackRock, which has this political sway, and they get their way to roll out this globalist agenda. So 50% of Aussies now rely on the government for their main source of income. And once you get to these sort of levels, it's very hard to push back. We're going to get to how they bring in these laws where you can't speak out against the government or anything. But this is one step away from, complete communism or universal basic income, where everybody is just reliant on the government. And, this is when economies begin to collapse. Now, one of the worst offenders recently has been the NDIS. So you can see these stats here. About 1 in 6 6-year-old boys are now on the NDIS, and the majority of these from this autism diagnosis. And so you've got 1 in 5 of all Australians are currently disabled. This is costing tens of billions taxpayers a year. And you talk to anyone that works in these, and the majority of the time they're getting paid heaps of money to do very little, and they kind of know it's a rort, but it's just the system. At the same time, we've got this foreign ownership of all our resources, and we've got all these huge companies that are basically paying no tax at all. So yes, you can argue that they've got to spend money to go out and do the prospecting and whatever, but these huge resource companies, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue and paying zero tax. We're giving away our gas, and they're getting all these subsidies. And at the same time, you've got countries like Norway, which have shown it's very, very doable to build these huge sovereign wealth funds, and many other countries in recent history have tried to do so, many of which have had their leaders overthrown by the globalists that don't like this sort of thing when you actually look after your citizens. But this is very possible. But meanwhile, the only proposals we're getting is to increase the taxes on everyday people. So this just shows you that the globalists really run this country, and our politicians are just puppets. This was manufacturing decline in Australia that's continued to just plummet. And this has all been part of an agreement that was actually made. Gough Whitlam signed Australia up to the United Nations inspired Lima Declaration, which required Australia to reduce its manufacturing by around 30%. So again, committing to the globalist goals at the expense of everyday Australians. But let's get to the real juicy stuff. And what most people are really fed up with is the extent of immigration. So 1,544 migrants every single day. And it's absolutely, you cannot deny that when we can't build enough houses quick enough, this is going to have flow-on effects on everything from public transport to, the health system, infrastructure, as well as the cost of living and obviously property. So this needs to slow down. And I don't think it's racist to say that. If you look at the ancestries of Australia, traditional, just like a lot of these European countries that have all already gone through this. And the same playbook is being used here in Australia. But I don't think saying any of this is racist. If you look at the foreign countries and birth for Australian residents, it's completely diverse. And these stats from 2021, things were still ticking along reasonably well back then, and in all the years before, we didn't have huge problems with racism. The media blows all that way out of proportion. And plenty of these countries here were all at war with each other in recent decades and generations. And this is a really important point, that when we see all this, the media driving up and really trying to push these divides amongst all these communities on every topic, this is all part of the same agenda. So there's plenty of people from all different backgrounds that are just happy to be here, that have come here, assimilated, learned our language and our way of life, and brought their own unique aspects to it and contributed to the diversity of Australia in a good way. But something has changed in recent years, and it's not just the sheer numbers, it's the type of people and that type of stuff as well. But before we get to that, I just want to mention this in relation to this other slide here with things like welcome of country. Now, we absolutely should be respectful of all different ethnicities and cultures and acknowledge when bad things happened in the past. But that it's not our fault now. We forgive and forget. And if you're with a group of friends and you find out that your two grandpas, had a tiff with each other way back in the day, that doesn't change our relationship now. That's way in the past. So we acknowledge these things, we treat each other equally and with respect, and we moved on. This constant guilting that it's all our fault, when it was the leaders at the time, the politicians at the time, it wasn't us. So treat everyone equally and with respect, and everyone will get on just fine. That's the way it was before we started to get these types of things. And again, I've got no problem with it and respecting these traditions. But every time you turn the radio, every time there's a sporting event, you talk to these truly Aboriginal people that are in touch with their culture and heritage, and even they think it's gone way too far, and it's kind of ridiculous now, and almost taking away from the spirituality and the sacredness of some of these traditions. So that's my little spill on that. But then other thing that they're being used, I think, extorted for, is what the government is now doing in taking away more and more of our land. So under these new native titles. And if you don't know about this, this was, Native Title Act amended and giving away our national parks all during COVID, which you didn't really hear about. And this is happening all across the world and across Canada now, with Australia projected to be 80% under native title by 2030. And you see in Canada now, where under the guise of climate change, you're going to get fined $25,000 for going for a walk or going paddling on a river because there's some new parasite in the river, and all these excuses where they're just making everyone slowly but surely being pushed into these 15-minute smart cities, and you're not allowed to go out in nature, you're not allowed to get vitamin D. The other thing, obviously, that they're going to say is the reason for all this is climate change, and more Aussies are noticing just all these bizarre weather patterns, these crazy floods, these unusual fires and this type of thing, and plenty of people are calling it out. And a few days later, after we see this in the sky, we get these huge, massive rain bombs and crazy floods continue to happen. Now, people can say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory all they want, but there's dozens of states in America now that have all passed bills to ban weather modification and geoengineering. And so people can argue that chemtrails aren't real all they like, but this is a very real phenomenon. And as I said, dozens of US states are pushing back against this, and it's time we did in Australia too. So with this migrant crisis, the real issue is what we've seen in Europe, where clearly there is a relationship and disproportional representation of some of these more radical groups. Now, it doesn't mean it's everyone at all, but the problem is that these people are consistently being let off. So this is the problem. The justice system, police are too afraid to do anything, and then the judges and whatever let all these people off. So this is the real problem. No amount of over-expensive machete bins is going to solve this. We have to get to the root cause and punish them accordingly, because otherwise we're going down the exact same path as Europe, where we've seen these huge increases in violent crime and crimes against women and children as well. And there's one country in Europe that didn't have this, that actually saw a 50% decrease, while everyone else in Europe, these countries were going through the roof. And that's because they had a stricter immigration policy. So that's all we need. Strict immigration policy and good law enforcement, zero tolerance on this violent crime and these, sexual depravity. Now, the other things that Aussies are fed up with is this police state where the police are turning on our own citizens at the same time while all these foreigners are being let off for these crimes. And this is what we need Aussies to come together and unite, just like we saw in COVID. How is it appropriate for the police that are Aussies? They put on these uniforms and, get power hungry, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're shooting people with rubber bullets that aren't wearing a mask. I'm not going to go into all that science today. You guys know I'm an ex-pharmacist, and I quit in 2017 when I realized the entire pharmaceutical industry is completely corrupt. And I got strikes on YouTube at the time for speaking out against COVID and all that type of stuff. But this is just crazy how far this all went. And this is being ushered in again in martial law in America at the moment. And it's going to come to Australia as well with these rallies, I believe, and I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. But what we're heading towards is this complete totalitarian police state where the government is the sole arbiter of truth. And think about the recent years, how many things they said were disinformation or whatever that turned out to be true. And this is insane that this is being allowed to happen. Once again, just like in Europe, we're now seeing everyday Aussies being arrested for posting things on socials that go against the government. And this needs to stop. This is what we're marching for, all this type of stuff. Now, I want to get into what I think the media, how they're going to try to spin all this. So recently we've seen these fake terrorism plots, staged events that were used to pass new lots of anti-Semitism laws that came out that they were actually being done by Israel Defense Force, insiders, staged jobs. It's all fake, but regardless of all that, the laws still get passed. So this is, the hate speech laws, anti-Semitism laws, all this stuff is just taking away and targeting freedom of speech under fake pretenses. And so people are starting to ask, why is this happening? And just as people are starting to wake up to the extent that the US politicians are blackmailed, Tucker Carlson talking here about Epstein, Mossad, and how Israel is clearly using this honey trap, this blackmail network to bribe and blackmail American politicians into making pro-Israeli decisions. All this is happening across all European countries, and make no mistake, it is happening here in Australia too. So when all these people are on the payroll from a certain small country, and when we're starting to see all this tie together in terms of the Epstein blackmail ring, and now we're seeing more and more, well, why are all our judges letting people off that are committing these horrible, horrible crimes? And this goes back many, many years now in Australia. If you haven't heard of the Wood Royal Commission, where high-profile people were named, and this went on for years and years before kind of dying out, you have to start to ask yourself, well, to what extent are our politicians blackmailed or under the control of foreign powers when 50% of these crimes are going unpunished in Australia towards children? It's just unacceptable. And at the same time, you've got this kind of normalization of this sexualizing of our youth, and our Prime Minister nominating all these books for awards. This is just crazy, crazy stuff. And the pollies are coming out and defending all this, getting 5-year-olds to start to question their sexuality. This is just absolute insanity that needs to stop. So if you haven't been down this rabbit hole before, I'd really encourage you to look into the Wood Royal Commission and everything that was happening with the investigation into organised pedo networks and the involvement of politicians, judges, the police force and all that at the time. But let's tie this all together. So when you see this type of thing, and nobody wants to see Australian flags burning, but what I would say is it's going to be a very, very small minority of people that are probably going to cause trouble. And some of that is going to be inside jobs and organised, staged fake events, just as we've seen in recent history in Australia. And just like we saw in the US on those January 6 riots where we had insiders like Ray Epps that are caught on camera talking about how they're going to go into the Capitol and pushing people to do the wrong thing. And these sort of people were feds. They were insiders. And so we know that the Murdoch-run Australian media, which is some of the worst and most concentrated in the world in terms of who it's owned by and what it's going to push, we know that even if that 99% of people are peacefully protesting, they're going to concentrate on the small minority that may do the wrong thing. Now, I hope there's none of that, but just be aware that they're going to blow this out of proportion. And the goal here is really to, as always, divide and conquer and create as much tension between the two main religious groups of these traditional values of Western countries and the migrants that are now flooding these countries, who have actually lived peacefully together in many places for generations. But the media is drumming this up and blowing a lot of this out of proportion, and then they're allowing this to happen by not stamping out the crime and letting it go and giving them bail. And this all seems too much of a coincidence at the exact time when they want to roll out digital ID. Palantir, Peter Thiel getting these huge contracts to mass surveil all Americans. They're pushing this biometric surveillance and all this data, iris scans. And this is no coincidence. All the timing of this, where it's about to come into effect in December in Australia, where you'll need to scan your face and use digital ID to check all your social media. They're even talking about Google, even your photos on your phone now and that type of stuff. It's just going to be absolutely everywhere. So this is why Aussies need to fight back. And when tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. I'm really looking forward to seeing the huge turnout of Aussies on August 31st and making some differences. And if you want more solutions on what we can do to fix this problem, Martin and I did this video, how we can save Australia before it's too late, a month or so ago as well. So guys, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Do you agree with all that? What do you disagree with? How do we make Australia the lucky country, the beautiful country with all the resources, beautiful weather, all that type of thing? We really can get Australia back on the right track if the people rise up and start calling out all this BS, corruption and double standards of our politicians, corporations and leaders. Hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. I'll talk to you again soon. Cheers.